Ahora. Vale. Volvemos al lío y nada, o sea, vamos a escuchar ahora para mí una de las referentes en materia en el debate sobre lo racial, de otras cosas porque es de las autoras y cuando utilizo, digamos, el término silencio sobre la raza en Europa, pues lo robé de ella, ¿no? de sus trabajos, ¿no? De Alana Lentin y nada, Alana es investigadora antirracista que trabaja en la teorización crítica de la raza, el racismo y el antirracismo. Ha vivido y trabajado en países como Reino Unido, Francia, Italia e Irlanda y actualmente vive en Gadigal Land, en Sydney, en Australia. Su último libro, que también lleva un poco a la línea del debate que nos planteará y va a compartir con nosotros ahora, tanto en la presentación que hace como en el debate posterior, Why Race Still Matters, para mí es también uno de los trabajos referentes que necesario, digamos, en el debate, un poco en la línea de lo que venimos trabajando en torno a la blanquitud y la necesidad de debate sobre lo racial en Europa. Actualmente edita la sección sobre movilizaciones y resistencia contra el racismo de la Enciclopedia Routledge de la raza y el racismo. Y nada, le damos paso a Alana para que nos presente las líneas clave y a partir, una vez termine la presentación de Alana, pues pasamos al debate. Así que nada, gracias de nuevo.
Hi, my name is Alana Lentin. I am a Jewish European woman who is a settler on Gadigal country in otherwise known Sydney, Australia. I begin by acknowledging that these lands were never ceded and pay my respects to Indigenous people. I recognise that I benefit from living on Gadigal country and moving with freedom through still colonised lands. As a teacher and a writer on race, I try to commit myself to the anti-colonial fight where I can. Today I'm going to talk about a chapter from my recent book, Why Race Still Matters, in which I develop a concept that I call not racism. I've been told that this idea has been helpful to many people to provide a way of thinking about why, when people talk about their experiences of racism, their voices are silenced and this is not heard. At the current time, there seems to be a structural denial of racism. There are many euphemisms for racism, as this quote shows, and there are thousands of other examples. The idea that we shouldn't say the word racist is quite prevalent. We saw this in recent times during the Donald Trump presidency, where, for example, as you can see from the picture here, Donald Trump targeted the 4 congresswomen of color known as the Squad, and then quickly followed up by refuting that he had been racist. In fact, he said, "I don't have a racist bone in my body." It's funny that there's always a racist bone. People seem to be competing about how to be the least racist. Last year, there was the debacle with the British royal family when Meghan Markle spoke about her experiences of racism. Very quickly, you had members of the royal family coming out to deny that they had been racist. As you can see here, you even had Princess Michael of Kent, who's well known for wearing a racist piece of jewellery. Yet the implication is the British royal family, with hundreds of years of colonial domination and exploitation of colonised peoples around the world, are somehow not responsible for racism. As the scholar Sarah Ahmed has remarked, racism is denied and offence is taken because it's often more outrageous to name the racism than to be racist. So in this climate, no one is actually a racist. So all of these statements will be familiar, I think, to you because they are just so repetitive. It is not only public figures like Prince William who constantly deny that they're being racist, or even to claim that they are anti-racist, but ordinary people as well, perhaps your family or friends, constantly repeat how something that they have literally just said is, quote, not racist. But what I am suggesting here is that beyond the denial of racism, what is particular to what I am calling not racism is that it contains a definition of racism which is constructed negatively, in other words, through opposition. This definition is characterized by the fact that it denies the experiences of people who face racism and negates that experience. But beyond this, it also formulates a definition of racism, which is said to be more true or more real, and above all, more objective than the definition of racism given by those who face it. In fact, central to not racism is actually the idea that those who experience racism can never be the true knowers of racism, because the argument is that they have been manipulated by their emotions. In this way, not racism is a form of what I call discursive racist violence. So we can see that the definition of not racism as a redefinition of racism is part and parcel of a positivist drive within the social sciences to center objectivity as a way of denying the lived experience of those at the pointy end of racism, colonialism, and other forms of definition. So what I'm calling not racism is also epistemically racist. So where did I first start observing this phenomenon? It actually started with this event, Finsbury Park in London in June 2017. A white man named Darren Osborne murdered a Muslim man named Makram Ali and injured 10 other people in front of Finsbury Park Mosque. He drove his van into these people, injuring and killing them. Now, while many people were quick to note that, as is generally the case, when the attacker is white, the media and politicians were very slow to name this a terrorist incident, what I thought was more interesting was the fact that everybody was rushing to say that this had nothing to do with racism, that it was not racist. So Osborne may have been unemployed and maybe even a terrorist, but the motivations, according to the media, were not hate, but maybe the result of his unstable mental condition, one in a long line of so-called lone wolves. The not racism label is therefore consistent with the identification of racism with hate and, to a lesser degree, with prejudice and with intolerance. So what I want to do in this talk is to set the scene for these constant judgments of what racism is and what it is not in the public sphere. And I want to do this by going back to the invention of racism as a term and to spend some time thinking about the relationship between race and racism as terms, and what does it mean about how we use them today. So what do we mean by race and what do we mean by racism? I want to think about what I call the white drive to define racism and the judgment of who gets to define it, to what ends, and under what conditions. Clawing back the definition of racism appears today to be a major struggle for anti-racists. But I think this has to be accompanied by an effort to place the term in history and think about how the term racism has been used politically in different ways and what the relationship between it and race is in and through the history of what we can call racial regimes or racial states. I argue that racism has been frozen in specific events that we see as being in and of the past. And usually there are three main events that we refer to: the Holocaust, apartheid in South Africa, and Jim Crow segregation in the United States. And we tend to separate these exemplary or outstanding or unusual events in the way that they're described from the longer history of racial rule. The power to define racism has become a major flashpoint in public discussions. To describe something as racist, then, is considered to be unhelpful or exaggerated. The question, though, of course, to whom it is unhelpful, shines a light on the gulf between dominant and subordinated accounts of racism that still exist despite decades of anti-racist activism. So, commonly we tend to speak about racism as being the motivator for race. Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example, has written that race is the child of racism, not the father. But I think that this is only true if we accept the definition of race that the proponents of racial science offered, in other words, that race is the same as identity. In what follows, I wish to discuss the relationship between race and racism in order to think more deeply about what is being refuted when something is said to be not racist. This will lead me on to a conclusion about what's happening today, because there's been a lot of speeding up since I wrote my book around these sort of questions. I want us to think about what do people who say that they or other people are being not racist think that they are actually being. Where does the ideology of racism come from, and how does it link to the project of racial rule? So practices of racial rule existed long before racism as a concept was invented. We now apply that definition to processes and practices that were not in fact ideologically formulated, or if they were not done so in the way that racism was thought of in the particular circumstances of late 19th, early 20th century Europe, when the word racism is first used, first actually by racists themselves, so people who proposed racial science in order to describe their project, and later in the 20s and 30s by people who started opposing racism and racial science. Now we might want to ask, well, why does any of this matter? After all, we should be able to name things as racist, and of course this is absolutely true, especially when it comes to campaigning. But if we want to understand why what I am calling not racism seems to be such a central part of how racism takes shape today in public discourse, then we need to go back to the history of how racism was named. Racism, according to Barnard Hesse, is a Eurocentric idea that focuses on the rising ideology of European fascism and the application of racial science to European populations. Given this, the concept of racism has been ill-equipped to encapsulate the full meaning of racial rule. This original formulation of racism itself puts a racialized hierarchy in place by prioritizing certain forms of injustice carried out in the name of race over others. And the prime example of this, of course, is anti-Semitism. Narrow views of racism, which detach it from the longer history of race, deny how race actually developed through various forms of legitimation. Stuart Hall talks about the passage from the geographical to the religious, and only lastly to the biological or the genetic as different modes in which race is expressed. The attachment of race to a singular meaning, the biological or genetic hierarchy with which we are most familiar, is actually problematic if we want a fuller understanding of race as a key technology of power in the modern colonial era. In fact, race is a messy and unstable concept that develops in situ within regimes of racial rule, colonialism, slavery, migration and borders, and so on. To function as a shorthand for human diversity, race necessarily relies on a range of legitimizing ideas, including culture, religion, geography, gender, sexuality, and all of these are attached to race or articulated with it. The continuing blurriness about how race coheres with certain bodies and how that shifts and slides around is evidence of how shaky that attachment is and how much work actually needs to be done to build and maintain the boundaries between racialized groups. So in my book, I argue that we need to go beyond repeating that race is a social construct, but we need to show how, why, and under what conditions race is made and remade continually, socially, politically, and economically. Race is in a constant process of being made and remade. It doesn't sit in its place. It doesn't stay the same. So the academic figures who were involved in the formulation of the idea of racism included a group of French physical anthropologists who were working from the late 19th century on in a book, I read about this in a book studied by the historian Carole Renaud-Paligot. And she really usefully shows that anti-racists, so these people who came up with the terminology of racism in order to struggle against the idea of race, were actually really unconcerned with anti-blackness, for example, or the practice of racial science in the colonies. She shows, following the trajectory of anthropology from the mid-1800s on, how this was the case. So she says that by the end of the 19th century, anthropology's efforts to establish standardized classifications of racial difference became challenged by newer research that went against the idea of the existence of biological racial groups. But this didn't actually stop many of the anthropologists who continued to use race to classify people into these biological groups. But by the mid-1930s, most European anthropologists had stopped seeing Europeans as racists and said that there was actually no link between race and nation, for example, as was the widespread belief in Europe at the time. Rising anti-Semitism in the Europe of the 1930s was almost completely unanimously denounced by these physical anthropologists in France. Nevertheless, despite general agreement that there was equality among the white races and that anti-Semitism was barbarous, the same could not be said for the question of equality among the so-called races of color. And in fact, between the two world wars, these anthropologists, while objecting to racism that was internal to Europe, continued to carry out race research in the colonial arena. So this was the backdrop for the evolution of the concept of racism among French anti-racist anthropologists. A case in point was Jacques Mio, who taught physiology of the human races at the University of Paris up until the 1950s. Mio was an anti-racist activist, member of the journal Raza, racismo, which was outspoken about the rise of Nazism. He believed that racism was a discriminatory German ideology, and he saw it as quite separate from the practice of race science. At the same time, he referred to cranial measurement research, so racial science research and measurement of people's skulls, to argue that in his view, black people's brains had 20% the capacity of those of white people. So what I'm saying is that the original interpretation of racism saw it as a problem that was internal to Europe, based on a false distinction made by the Germans between different groups of European white people, including Jews. The anthropologists and others who challenged this racism were actually able to do so while at the same time condoning, or at least failing to mention, the persistence of racial colonial domination. So colonialism goes hand in hand with the objection to racism within Europe. Now this Eurocentric cutting off of ideological racism from actual racial rule paved the way for the liberal understanding of racism that still dominates today. Racism as a moral wrong, that is about objectionable attitudes and beliefs about other people who are seen as racially distinct. Now, the problem with this definition is that it lends itself to being universalized. In other words, everyone can have racist attitudes if we only think about it as in the realm of ideas. And it separates beliefs and values from the sphere of practices, policies, laws, technologies, and so on. In other words, the areas in which race as a form of rule actually operates. The fact that racism is seen in this way gives us a clue as to why so much outrage is there when people have their racism pointed out. Calling someone's words or actions racist is seen as actually calling them immoral. To make things more concrete, someone can believe, for example, that, immigration has gone too far, that there are too many migrants in the country, but at the same time say, well, I'm not being racist. And it's not just that they are being hypocritical, but actually the dominant understanding of what racism is gives us the opportunity to be able to say things like, I'm against immigration, or there are too many Muslim people in the country. However, I am not racist. You've all heard the expression, I'm not racist, but ... So opposing immigration here is common sense and nothing to do with race. People who oppose immigration tend to claim that they don't hate immigrants or even think of them as inferior, but they talk about things like, well, there's only so much money to go around, there's only so much space, and they justify their racism in this way. But this now dominant idea, we need to see it and see that it's been purposefully constructed over the last 40 or so years. I want to end by talking a little bit about the role of some academics and public commentators in advancing the idea of not racism. The idea that there is a so-called normal definition of racism that most people understand, importantly people who are not usually the targets of racism, allows those who are negatively racialized for their real-life experiences to be rejected as I'm saying, not racism. So again, this starts in 2017 when there was a publication of this report called Racial Self-Interest is Not Racism. And so I want to talk about how this idea evolves. And I want to end by stating that far from this being a sort of a fringe idea in certain corners of the university, this is actually has become in many places a dominant idea. So in my book, I refer to the case of the political scientist Eric Kaufmann, who is a professor in London. Despite aligning himself with so-called race realists, including people who are proponents of eugenics, Kaufmann has a veneer of respectability because he claims to wish to salvage real racism from what he sees as the false accusations coming from leftist, anti-racist mobs. Kaufmann claims that what he calls a left moralist agenda has become dominant. Its spokespersons, who are, he says, academics, students, activists, progressive politicians, journalists, and so on, wrongly portray the ethnic majority, in other words, white people, as being racist. Now, he develops these theses in a number of places. First is this report, which he published in March 2017 for the centre-right London-based think tank, the Policy Exchange, Racial Self-Interest is Not Racism. And he elaborates on this in a book he published in 2018 called White Shift. So Kaufman is now one of the major proponents of the argument, first promoted by the Trump administration and championed by all and sundry, from US governors to UK government ministers, Australian politicians, French politicians, etc., that critical race theory, or indeed any study of race or of colonial history, is a dangerous ideology. Kaufman's main point is that white Christian ethno-traditionalism, as he calls it, should be seen simply as one among a range of possible identifications or identity positions, and that seeking to defend it against the imported cultures of non-European immigrants is, he says, racial self-interest. In other words, white people protecting their own interests and their own identity group, but it is not racism, according to him. He concludes that what he calls racial self-interest is a more appropriate framework for understanding, for example, why white people voted for Trump, or why many white people and others in Britain voted for Brexit, and why they are opposed to immigration. He says that this vote wasn't an expression of any racism towards other ethnic or racialized groups, but that merely these people felt that they should be able to protect themselves against encroaching minorities in a world in which there were fewer and fewer resources. So Kaufman's study is proposed as a route out of the constraints imposed by a focus on racism, which he says is counterproductive, or, I used the expression earlier, unhelpful. Kaufman says that unlike racism, the language of ethnic self-interest or racial self-interest doesn't pack the same emotive punch, and therefore is likely to promote debate rather than division. So the idea here is that as soon as you say the word racism, people become emotional and they don't want to discuss and debate in sort of fair terms. Kaufman's study contributes to the idea of what racism is by telling us what it is not. Racism is recharacterized as irrational and based on hatred and fear, while racial self-interest should be seen as an understandable position. Backing up the study, David Goodhart of the think tank The Policy Exchange in the UK explains the difference between racism and what he calls white identity politics, as you can see on the slide. He claims that racism has been subject to what he calls mission creep, and proposes that applying the label of racism to concerns about immigration lead to those in the public debate being unable to draw a distinction between what he calls group partiality, in other words, liking your own group or wanting to stay within your own group, and a racism that he says is based on the fear, hatred, or disparagement of out groups. So the stress here is on what he names as the normal definition of racism. And according to this normal definition, in Goodhart's terms, racism is always irrational. So here I think is a clear example of the Eurocentric definition of racism as being something that is beyond the limits of acceptable discourse. The idea of the normal definition of racism enacts the separation between rationality and irrationality, which, as we know, is also a central idea within racist discourse, that there are civilized humans and other humans who are underdeveloped, that we are rational and that they are irrational. In fact, of course, it's untrue to say that racism is always irrational on either logical or moral grounds. Slavery is the prime example of people being racist in a rational, profit-seeking manner. What is politically interesting about this is that even those who can be labeled as having extreme racist views can be characterized as presenting common sense opinions that can be massaged out of Goodhart's definition of the of the normal definition of racism. And we saw this, for example, in the case of the Christchurch terrorist who murdered 52 Muslim mosque goers. People public figures made statements such as, well, of course what he did was abhorrent, but it was rational for him to fear too many Muslims in the country. Now, what's worrying about the definition of not racism, apart from everything that I've already said, is that it is actually explicitly being used by academics and other public figures to argue for more racist speech in public. Key actors such as Eric Kaufmann have also supported openly racist research, such as that of Noah Carl, who publishes on so-called positive eugenics. A key site for the publication of what their authors call race realist positions is the online magazine Colette. The website has published articles, for example, questioning whether Black, Latinx and Indigenous people have actually died from COVID-19 at a higher rate, although research shows us that they have. Under the guise of promoting unhindered freedom of speech and so-called dangerous or controversial ideas, Colette has actually become the home of a new racist pop science. More recently, a new report published by Eric Kaufmann and colleagues on academic freedom argues that current academic culture in the UK restricts the freedom of those who disagree with this dominant left moralist agenda that Kaufmann names. In other words, people should be free, according to this report, to voice racist, homophobic and transphobic views in the interests of academic freedom and so-called debate. Now, this issue is important because voices like the authors of this report have managed to portray themselves in public as having been silenced by a so-called woke majority. However, in fact, the report has been now used to justify the decision of the UK Education Minister to act against or to make policies against what he calls the unacceptable silencing and censoring of conservative or so-called controversial views on campuses. In fact, we know that structural racism means that it is most often Black people and people of colour who are marginalised, not only obviously in academia, but across all of society's institutions. However, the dominance of the framework of not racism means that the free speech to air racist views takes precedence over the fight to redress systemic race-based disadvantage. The lack of attention to institutional and structural racism was also evident in the publication of the UK Commission on Ethnic and Racial Disparities report on racism, which actually claimed that institutional racism does not exist and that colonisation and slavery should be painted in a more positive light in the teaching of history. Where I sit, in Australia, on still colonised Indigenous lands, the Senate recently voted to reject critical race theory after a motion introduced by the far right-wing One Nation Party. This echoes similar moves in the US and the UK and France. And of course, we know that critical race theory is not taught in schools or even very much at universities. But the majority view is that Australia should move on and embrace its ideology of quote-unquote successful multiculturalism. The context for the rejection of critical race theory is actually the move to slightly adapt the education curriculum to reflect the fact that the British did in fact invade Indigenous lands and that Indigenous peoples were massacred in the process. However, many conservatives are opposed to such truth-telling and claim that racism is now being reversed onto white people, which is, of course, as we know, completely untrue and impossible. The history of the evolution of the term racism and the mainstream distancing of racism from its roots in European history, colonization, enslavement, genocide, and the ongoing dispossession of Indigenous lands, repackaged as individual bad attitudes, is a really important factor for understanding the form that is being taken by the backlash against anti-racism today. This is obviously not a problem that can only be found in Australia or the UK, the two examples I've mainly drawn on today, But it can be seen anywhere that people are rising up against racializing power, be it the Black Lives Matter movement, the struggle for Indigenous sovereignty, or the fight of formerly colonized people against racial violence and discrimination. In closing, we must remember that the struggle to redefine racism, which I am calling not racism, is a response to the rising up of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. It is because of the growing strength of our movement that there is a continual cycle of backlash. As can be seen from this photo of the protest that is held every year to mark the day on which Aboriginal lands were invaded, the 26th of January 1788, the movement is constantly growing. Where there is power, there is always resistance. Thank you very much for having me.